At night, the guards went down to the dungeon as instructed, to check the prison cells and locks. One of the young guards noticed a light under the door. They came closer. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light was shining through the crack. The senior guard pushed the door open and saw the queen in the barred cell. She was sitting on a low bench, holding onto the bars with her hands. In front of her, on the straw, was a knight in rags, his hands tied. He raised his head and looked straight at the newcomers. There was no fear in his eyes. The queen did not turn around. The senior guard said, "Take your place." He entered the cell and grabbed the woman by the elbow. She did not resist. The knight stood up and stepped towards the door, but remained calm. "Who are you?" asked the senior guard. The queen replied quietly, "I have come to see him." The guard led her up the stairs, and the knight remained seated. During the night, he heard footsteps and the jingle of keys, and told himself it meant nothing. Then he heard the door to her chamber being locked. He thought about what he had seen. Not a bold act, not a game, but the weariness of two people who had found peace in each other. He waited for morning. In the morning, the king asked the queen why she was pale and why her eyes had darkened. She replied briefly, "I have a headache." He nodded silently. He had been king for a long time. He had seen many reasons for his wife's paleness: unsuccessful childbirth, illness, fear of politics. He did not press the matter. He thought more about tomorrow's council and the war. Later, the chamberlain reported to the king on the nightly inspection of the chambers. No one saw anything unusual. The king returned to his papers and forgot that night as a trifle. The queen returned to her duties, but she could not forget that night, because it was not just a meeting at the bars. She remembered his voice, how he spoke of his people, of the death of his people, of how his fortress had fallen. She remembered how he looked at her when she brought him food, and how his hand briefly touched her fingers. In those first weeks, her visits were brief. She would come, stand at the bars and listen. She spoke little. He talked about battles, about guilt, and about the world that had ended for him. There was less rhetoric and more truth in his words than in those spoken at court. She was the king's wife by duty, not by love. He rarely came to her bedroom. He spoke at court and to the army, but he did not speak to her as a human being. She played her role, wore her jewels, performed the ceremonies. By day she sat at receptions. By night she wondered why a stranger could be more honest than her husband. Finally, one day she stayed longer than usual. The guards were already rushing through the corridors. Tears were welling up in her eyes, but she put aside all her titles and simply sat down next to him. He said, "You're taking a risk." She said, "I know." They talked for a long time. She asked for advice, asked him to listen. He listened and did not judge. That was how everything else began. Their meetings became more frequent. First through the bars, then by lifting a board in the floor, through which they passed notes. She asked that he not be hurt when he gave testimony. He said it was easier for him to talk to her. He called her by her name, not her title, and it was the first time she had heard that since she became queen. She responded in kind. One night, when the chambers were quiet and the candles were almost extinguished, she opened the bars and put her hand on his cheek. He did not pull away. She kissed him on the straw, quietly, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. He squeezed her hand and whispered, "If you get caught, I'll say I provoked you." She pulled away. "Don't say that." Her voice trembled, but it wasn't fear. It was determination. She understood the consequences. She knew that if the truth came out, the kingdom would be thrown into turmoil, the court would be divided, and her husband would be embittered. She knew that the king had enemies who would rejoice at any sign of weakness. She knew that her name would be on everyone's lips, and people would judge faster than they would think. She thought about the throne, about the king's children, about who would take power if the king gave up. She wondered if her love could protect anyone. But that night, she decided to go ahead. They began to plan carefully. She asked the maid to keep the doors open at night. She left food and warm clothes by the bars. He told her what he could do if he were pardoned. He promised to leave, to hide, to disappear. She didn't believe he could just walk away. She was more afraid than she thought. But she came anyway. Inside, she felt guilty and relieved. He asked her, "Don't tell anyone." She nodded. Rumors began to circulate slowly at court. One lady-in-waiting noticed that the queen had been walking at night recently. The lady-in-waiting asked, "Are you restless? Are you not sleeping?" The queen smiled and replied that it was insomnia. The lady-in-waiting left. But the lady-in-waiting told a maid, and the maid told the chamberlain. The chancellery saw the nightly lists, who entered the dungeon and who left. One of the clerks noted that the queen had several unknown exits, according to the schedule. This list fell into the hands of the chamberlain. He looked at the records, frowned, and went to the king. "She goes out at night," he said. The king looked up at him and said, "Keep watch." The words were simple. They meant a lot. That night, the queen entered the dungeon later than usual. She heard the chamberlain's footsteps less often than before. She thought they would notice her. She thought about how to save the night if she had to. They met at the bars and silently held hands through the bars. He looked into her eyes and said, "You've changed." She gave a short laugh. "So have you." He squeezed her hand. She stepped back and whispered, "If anything happens, promise me you won't give in." He nodded. She climbed the stairs, and when the door to her room slammed shut, she put her hand to her chest and felt her heart beating. She knew she was being watched, but she also knew she would return. She returned to the dungeon more often. The days were all the same. Receptions, lavish halls, smiles for guests. The nights were different. She spent the nights with him. They talked, licked the wounds of the past, argued about duty and honor. They learned to understand each other. "You've changed," he said once when she came in later than usual. Her eyes were red. She sat down on the edge of the bench and took off her scarf. "I'm afraid," she said. "Not just for myself," she continued quietly. He looked at her and reached out his hand. She placed her palm on his wrist. His skin was rougher than that of the nobles, but warm. "What did they call you at home?" he asked. "Martha," she replied. She did not mention any titles. He smiled as best he could. A man who had been kept in a cage for a year. "I am Raoul," he said. "I thought I would only be given a name in battle." She laughed silently. It was a rare laugh. They held each other's hands, and the silence was not painful. They began to make plans. "If I ask for mercy, he will ask why," he said. "Say you made a mistake," she suggested. "He won't accept that," he replied. She decided to seek help from the old chamberlain, the one who kept order but sometimes felt pity. She sent a note through the maid. "Meet me at the south porch at midnight." The chamberlain came and sat opposite her. She put down the tablet with the knight's name and said bluntly, "I beg you, help him escape. Say that he was another man's servant, that his name is wrong." The chamberlain looked at her silently. He remembered the king's orders. Finally, he said, "If I help, I will be killed." She nodded. "I am not asking you for my sake. I am asking for his sake." The chamberlain thought for a moment, then pressed his lips together. "I cannot make any promises," he said, "but I can delay the execution if you give me a reason." She began to cry. The chamberlain left without making any promises. Other events were taking place in the castle. The ambassadors were demanding more troops. The court was becoming more crowded. The king walked around irritated. He saw the queen with her empty gaze and did not understand. "We must strengthen the borders," he said at meetings, and everyone nodded. He increasingly remained alone in his chambers and drank wine. Sometimes he raised his voice in the presence of courtiers and spoke harsh words. She listened and remained silent. One day, a new guard appeared in the dungeon. He had been sent from the royal guard. He was strict, attentive, and knew his job. His name was Bartholomew. His presence meant control. After a week, he noticed that the queen was coming more often than she should. He began to watch her. "You go down there often," he said to one of the maids. "The queen has nighttime concerns," she replied. Bartholomew did not believe her. He began to spend the night at the door of the dungeon himself, writing down names. Once he approached the cell and looked through the crack. He saw the figure of a woman. Then he saw her being led upstairs. He memorized the lady-in-waiting's face and clothes. But he did not tell the king right away. He understood that information passed quickly must be accurate. Meanwhile, the queen and Raoul were talking about the future. "If I leave, I will leave the throne," she said. "Do you know what will happen to your people?" They will survive without me, he replied more sharply than usual. Don't say that. I want to live not for the people, but for us. I want you to live freely. She looked at him. She understood that this was impossible. They argued, and details emerged during the argument. He admitted that he was afraid of being a tool in the hands of the king's enemies. She said she was afraid of changing the order that kept thousands of people in place. One day, the queen's child interrupted their conversation. It was not her child, but the king's son from a previous marriage, the young prince. He had come to the dungeon secretly because he could not live without people who did not lie. He sat down by the bars and listened. Why are you afraid? He asked suddenly. The queen looked at the boy, then at Raoul. He frowned and said, He is not an enemy. He brought comfort to your mother. The queen could not hide her embarrassment. She squeezed the boy's hand. Rumors continued to spread. A new lady-in-waiting, who was not trusted, began to abuse what she knew. She told her neighbor that the queen walked at night. The rumors reached the nobles, and they whispered among themselves. The chamberlain began to report more frequently. The king sensed that something was wrong. He began to watch himself. He was not stupid. He knew that his mother's distrust and betrayal could undermine his power. He hired people to watch the queen. One evening, the queen came and found the chamber cold. Raoul was not there. He returned with a blood-stained shirt. He fell to his knees and wept when he saw her face. What happened? She asked. At first, he could not speak. Then he whispered, I was beaten during interrogation. He adjusted his handkerchief. She took his head in her lap and wiped away the blood. She asked who. Bartolomeo's men, he said. They wanted to know who was helping you. He looked at her. I didn't say anything. She took his hand and squeezed it tightly. I'll tell the king it's a mistake. I'll say it's a political arrest and ask for his mercy, she suggested. He looked at her in a way no one had ever looked at her before. You won't do that, he said. You know what that will lead to. If you say you love me, they'll cut you down like a weed. She was silent. She knew he was right. They began to think about escape in a different way. If it was impossible to get him out of the castle directly, they could forge a list, exchange documents, and pretend that he was a servant of a nobleman who was traveling to the capital. This required time, money, and people. She began to gather listeners, those she trusted. The maids reconciled and began to change the records. The chamberlain gave in. He delayed. But Bartholomew thought it was not enough. He increased the patrols. One night, when the plan was almost ready, the king suddenly returned earlier than usual. He entered his chambers and found the queen in her nightgown, sitting at a table with documents. He did not say a word. The queen looked up. The king said dryly, What is this? She replied, Work. Tax documents. He handed one of his men a piece of paper and ordered him to check it. The men left. The queen felt her heart sink. When the doors slammed shut, she had no time to think. She got up and went to the window, where she could see the dark shadow of the courtyard. The king came out into the hall that evening and said in front of everyone, I hear we have problems in the corridors. A soft whistle sounded. No one knew what would happen next. At night, they began to act. The plan was simple and dangerous. The chamberlain agreed to help only because he saw how exhausted the queen was. He gave her some papers and a small folding chest, into which they placed the forged documents and seals. She took everything upon herself and said quietly, If this doesn't work, I'll come to him and say, Run. He nodded and said no more. Raoul was ready to leave. He whispered, Where shall we meet? She gave him the coordinates of the old mill house behind the village. They discussed the time and exchanged final instructions. She looked at him for a long time, as if she wanted to memorize his face. He held her hand and squeezed it as if to make sure she was alive. No one breathed loudly. No one dared to make a sound. The servants accompanied the chest. The chamberlain gave orders to the footmen. Have the chest taken to the southern gate. I will sign the documents. They loaded the cargo. The queen sat in the carriage, which had been prepared as if for a night visit to her subjects. By the light of the torches, she whispered to Raoul, If we leave, know that I will wait. He leaned over and kissed her forehead. See you soon, he said. He had no time for talk of dreams. When the carriage drove out of the gate, Bartholomew was already lying in wait. Someone had informed him, a lady-in-waiting who was trying to advance her career. She had been offered protection and a share of the reward. She had seen the queen leaving at night and told all. Bartholomew felt that he would be thoroughly investigated if he missed this opportunity. He ordered the carriage to be stopped on the bridge and surrounded it with his men. The carriage stopped. The chamberlain got out and looked up in surprise. Bartholomew approached with a serious expression. "What's in the chest?" he asked. The chamberlain replied habitually, "Tax documents." Bartholomew casually opened the chest and saw papers with seals that did not match. He grabbed the chamberlain and ordered the carriage to be opened. Inside they found clothes, a bag of food, and a note. Guards immediately appeared, and the carriage was taken back to the castle under guard. The queen realized that the plan had been foiled. She stood up in the carriage, grabbed the chest and shouted, "Let us go!" Her voice sounded sharp. Bartholomew silently motioned to the guards to lead her to the throne. When the gate doors slammed shut, the queen realized she was out of the game. She looked at Raoul and whispered, "I didn't know she would betray us." Raoul clenched his fists and stared at the floor. His face was pale. "It's my fault," he said quietly. "I should have left earlier." The court gathered in the throne room. The king sat on the throne and watched. A carriage was brought before him, the coachman silent. The chamberlain stood nearby, unable to look the queen in the eye. Bartholomew stepped forward and said loudly, "Your Majesty, we have uncovered a conspiracy." Forged documents and seals were found in the chest, as well as an escape plan for the prisoner. The king rose from his chair. His gaze was heavy. He approached the carriage and asked, without changing his voice, "Who is this man?" Someone pushed Raoul forward. He stood in the mud and looked straight into the king's eyes. "Are you a traitor?" asked the king. "I am an enemy," replied Raoul. "I fought against you. I took up arms and marched on your castle. I was captured. I do not ask for mercy. Why are they trying to take him away?" The king asked the queen so that the whole hall could hear. She stepped forward and said calmly, "Because I asked for clemency. I asked for him to be sent away. I gave the papers. I thought it was the only way." There was a murmur in the hall. Someone sighed. The king clenched his fists. He turned away and pretended not to be listening. Then he looked around at those present and said, "The love between the queen and the captive knight is not just a personal weakness. It is a threat to the state. Who knows what conspiracy may lie behind it?" Raoul took a step forward and said, "Your Majesty, if I am a threat, kill me. I will go into battle. I am not fit for a life of peace." His voice trembled, but he spoke directly. He looked at the queen and added, "I did not love her as a queen. I loved her as Martha. I do not ask for mercy, but I ask that you spare her." The queen raised her hand to her mouth and pulled her handkerchief towards her. Her voice trembled as she said, "I love him. I know it is a crime. I am ready to accept punishment. But I beg you, do not kill him in public. He is not to blame for what happened between us. The fault is mine." The king looked at his wife for a long time. His face betrayed no emotion. "You say you are ready to accept punishment," he said. "What do you propose?" She lowered her head and said quietly, "My punishment is exile. I will go to a convent. I will relinquish my power. I will leave if you pardon him." The hall buzzed again. Some whispered, "Nuns? Is that mercy?" Others looked at the king, waiting. The chamberlain stood with a tense face, thinking that the effect would be different. The king was silent. Finally, he said, "Exile is too lenient after such a crime. My wife's betrayal is ruining the dynasty. I cannot allow my family to become weak in the face of our enemies. He, Raoul, must be punished as a traitor. You, Martha, will be stripped of your full rights and sent into seclusion, under guard. Your family and children will remain at court. If even a single rumor takes the form of a conspiracy, the punishment will be more severe." The queen looked at the king and heard the final decision in his voice. She looked up at Raoul. "If you say it was my wish, they will kill you," she whispered. He smiled sadly and replied, "I am ready." She grabbed his hand and pressed it to her heart, as if she wanted to give him life. At that moment, She knew that betrayal could not be undone. Raoul was led to the eastern square. People had gathered there, where military parades were usually held. The king did not want the execution to be a secret. He wanted to show that order had been restored. The queen stood next to the chamberlain, her hands bound. She looked at Raoul, and in her eyes there was only one word: love. People whispered, "She looks calm." No one understood what was going through her mind. Raoul climbed onto the scaffold. He looked at the crowd and said loudly, "I did not call for conspiracy. I brought her comfort. I loved her. I do not ask for mercy." His voice was clear. He looked at the king and added, "I die for the one I love." The queen cried out his name. He turned and shouted back, "Farewell, Martha." His lips twitched, but he kept his composure. When the sword fell, the queen closed her eyes and clenched her fist. The chamberlain sensed that she was feeling unwell. She was taken under guard to a dark room that had been prepared as a cage. There, when everyone had left, she was left alone with the chamberlain, who stood there, not knowing what to do. She took his hand and said quietly, "Help me die. It is better than living like a shadow." The chamberlain recoiled. He said, "I can't." She cried and found a small bottle in her hair that she had been carrying with her. Her hands trembled as she brought it to her mouth. "I don't want people to see me die in shame," she said. "I want to go quietly." The chamberlain fell to his knees and tried to grab the bottle. She pulled her hand away, looking him in the eyes. "You promised to help me if I needed it," she whispered. He was silent. She leaned over and drank the contents. The bottle tasted bitter. The chamberlain screamed and tried to call a doctor, but it was too late. Her eyes closed slowly. She managed to whisper, "Remember him, don't let them forget." Then her breathing stopped. The next morning, the court learned of the queen's death. The king was silent, but people whispered that her death was intentional. The chamberlain turned pale. He knew that tears would not bring back Raoul or Martha. He saw how the court had grown colder. The king gave the order, "Let this be a lesson." No one came to her body. She was buried quickly, without luxury. Time passed. The kingdom survived. Wars came and went. But sometimes at feasts the old nobles would whisper, "Do you remember Martha and Raoul?" Someone would say, "It was a weakness that almost killed us all." Another would add, "Or maybe it was love." But time does not forgive those who dare to put their personal feelings above their duty. The chamberlain lived a long life, and in his old age he often took out the handkerchief that Martha had once used to wipe her tears. He never said publicly that he had not done everything he could. Sometimes at night he would whisper, "Forgive me," and he believed that in a sense he had atoned for his guilt through service and care. But for the few who remembered that evening on the scaffold, the story ended like this. Two people loved each other, and their love destroyed them both. The court did not know what to do with the silence after her death. The first days were spent in official paperwork and memorial services. The king kept up appearances. He sat at his desk, signed decrees, received ambassadors. His words were even, but his servants looked at him differently. He stopped drinking wine in public. Sometimes he would enter the room where the queen's body lay, pause at her chambers, and leave. No one saw him cry. He did not allow public displays of emotion. The chamberlain was old. His face had turned white. He walked around the courtyard, avoiding conversation. After the funeral, he was summoned to the hall and asked for details. He answered calmly and silently. Once, a young nobleman approached him and said bluntly, "Did you know she was going to poison herself?" The chamberlain lowered his eyes and said quietly, "I knew she was ready for anything." "You could have stopped her," insisted the nobleman. The chamberlain looked at him and replied, "I did what I could, but not all decisions are mine to make." The words were simple. People decided that the answer had been found, and silence became part of their thoughts. The prince, a boy, sometimes came to the coffin alone. He stood in front of the wooden box and stroked the lid with his palm. His eyes were large and empty. He remembered Raoul's voice, remembered Martha's touch, remembered the cry on the scaffold. Once he asked the king, "Dad, why did they die?" The king took his son by the shoulders and said, "Because that's what happens when people choose their hearts over their duty." The boy didn't understand. He shook his head and left. He grew up quiet and rarely smiled. The people began to talk. Women gossiped in the markets. She wanted to leave for love. Others said, her actions could have ruined us. In a tavern, an old soldier who had fought for the king said, "We have rules. Without rules, we will die." Young people listened and drew their own conclusions. For some, Martha became a reckless woman. For others, she was a bitter example of human weakness. Most important were the political consequences. The warring lord saw weakness. Ambassadors from neighboring states came and asked the king about stability. The king replied firmly, "The crown will not fall." But those same ambassadors understood that a crack had appeared in the kingdom. One of the lords proposed to convene a council and nominate a candidate for an important position. Others agreed. A reshuffle began within the court. Those who had previously relied on the queen's favor lost their privileges. Those who supported the king received new appointments. Everything happened quietly, without open conflict, but the changes came quickly. Several months passed. At one of the councils, an old general, a man who had known the king since his youth, approached and said, "Your Majesty, the people are whispering about you. They say you are cruel and cold. They say they do not see a man in the crown." The king looked at him and said briefly, "Power requires firmness." The general nodded silently. After the council, the king began to make fewer appearances. He spoke with the rulers, but not with the people. One night, the chamberlain could no longer bear it and came to the young prince. They sat in a dark room by the light of a single candle. The prince asked, "Do you remember how she cried before she left?" The chamberlain nodded. "I saw how afraid she was," he said. The prince looked at him and asked sharply, "Why didn't anyone help her?" The chamberlain took the boy's hand and said quietly, "We were all afraid. We thought we were doing the right thing for many people." The prince said, "I want them to remember them differently." The chamberlain did not answer. He understood that the boy's words would not change the past, but he realized that there might be compassion in the next generation. The next few years were dry. The king increased security, changed the laws on the treatment of prisoners, and introduced strict rules on nighttime outings. These were security laws, but people understood that they were adopted for his peace of mind. Others believed it was revenge. People who knew Mart closely left the court. Those who remained spoke quietly and laughed less often. The court became more professional, colder, as if business routine had returned and wiped out emotions. 10 years passed. The prince grew up. His face became similar to the king's, but his eyes were different. He often thought about what he had seen in his childhood. He read books, listened to old people, but most often he came to the old general and asked about human decisions, about how to be fair and strong at the same time. The general replied, "Justice and strength are not always the same thing. You must choose and not be afraid of the consequences." The prince was silent. He remembered Raoul's voice and Marta's words. "Remember me." The chamberlain lived to a ripe old age, and once wrote a short letter. It contained simple lines. "I remember them. I have not forgotten their names. I regret that I did not do more." The letter was placed in a box, and years later, several people found it and read it. It did not bring back life, but it reminded them of how people had made mistakes. The story of Marta and Raoul became part of the conversations at home, part of those ancient parables that are passed down from older to younger generations. Some repeated that one cannot put personal interests above the state. Some said that people have a right to happiness. The story prevented people from making a clear choice because it had two sides, love and duty, and neither could win completely. When that king died, he was buried without unnecessary words. No one spoke of Marta at the funeral. The prince, now an adult, stood by his father's coffin and held a small handkerchief in his palm. He did not make a loud statement. He simply put the handkerchief in his pocket and left. Many later said that he began to rule differently. He did not forget the lessons of the older generation. He did not repeat their mistakes. But stories live long in palaces. They are told in whispers, and they influence people quietly, like a shadow that remains after a fire.